In the aftermath of the First World War, armored warfare emerged as a defining feature of modern battle. European armies studied the lessons of 1914-1918 with intense scrutiny, recognizing that tanks, first employed on the Western Front in 1916, could break the stalemate of trench warfare. In the Soviet Union, this recognition was sharpened by the country's own experiences in civil war and border conflicts during the 1920s and 1930s. The Red Army, preparing for potential wars in both Europe and Asia, closely followed foreign tank developments, while simultaneously attempting to create designs suitable for its own vast geography. Soviet military planners faced unique strategic requirements. The USSR's immense territory meant that armored units had to be mobile across diverse terrains, forests, marshes, plains, and steppe while remaining simple enough for rapid mass production. Soviet leadership observed conflicts abroad, particularly the Spanish Civil War of 1936-1939, where both German Panzer I and Soviet-supplied T-26 and BT series tanks clashed. These encounters revealed the vulnerabilities of light armor to modern anti-tank guns, pushing Soviet designers to reconsider the balance of speed, firepower, and protection. By the late 1930s, the BT Fast Tank series, derived from American engineer J. Walter Christie's designs, dominated Soviet armored units. The BTs were fast, capable of up to 70 kilometers per hour on tracks and even faster on wheels, but their thin armor was easily penetrated by German 37mm Pak-36 anti-tank guns. Soviet intelligence understood that Germany, after remilitarizing, was investing in newer Panzer III and Panzer IV models with 30-50mm frontal armor. In 1937, Soviet leadership commissioned the Kharkov Komintern Locomotive Plant, KHPZ, to develop a replacement. Engineer Mikhail Koshkin, appointed head of the design bureau, pursued a radical concept, a tank that combined the mobility of the BT with significantly greater protection and firepower. This design became the A-20 and A-32 prototypes, tested in 1938 and 1939. The A-32, with 32mm armor and a 76.2mm gun, was later up-armored to 45 meters and renamed the T-34 prototype. The context of looming war accelerated these efforts. The German invasion of Poland in September 1939 demonstrated the effectiveness of mechanized blitzkrieg tactics, where tanks spearheaded rapid advances supported by aircraft. Soviet observers noted how Polish defenses, reliant on outdated armor and cavalry, collapsed in weeks. The Winter War with Finland, 1939-1940, offered another lesson. Soviet T-26 and BT tanks struggled against Finnish fortifications and Molotov cocktails. The losses were severe. Of approximately 2,500 Soviet tanks deployed, over 600 were destroyed or captured, exposing weaknesses in armor and coordination. By early 1940, Koshkin and his team recognized the need for heavier sloped armor, a concept relatively novel at the time. Angled plates increased effective thickness without adding excessive weight. The prototype T-34, with 45mm of sloped frontal armor and a 76.2mm L-11 gun, was approved. In March 1940, Koshkin undertook a proving march from Kharkov to Moscow and back, covering over 2,000 kilometers, to demonstrate the tank's reliability. Despite Koshkin's declining health, the test impressed Stalin and the general staff. The T-34 was accepted for production in December 1939, with the first units rolling off the line in 1940. At the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Red Army possessed around 1,000 T-34s, compared to the older T-26s and BTs, of which over 15,000 were still in service. The T-34 represented a revolutionary leap. German reports from summer 1941 noted with alarm that standard 37mm anti-tank guns were ineffective against its frontal armor. Panzer III tanks, equipped with 37mm or short 50mm guns, struggled to penetrate. Only heavier 88mm flak guns or close-range 75mm howitzers posed a reliable threat. Thus, the T-34 emerged from a specific geopolitical and military context, the USSR's vast geography, lessons from Spain and Finland, and awareness of German rearmament. It was not merely another tank, but a calculated response to the challenges of modern mechanized warfare. Its combination of mobility, fire. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on 22nd of June 1941, the Soviet Union faced a massive invasion along a front that stretched nearly 2,900 kilometers. Approximately 3.8 million German troops, supported by 3,500 tanks and 4,000 aircraft, advanced into Soviet territory. Against this force, the Red Army deployed 15,000 tanks, but the majority were outdated T-26 light tanks and BT fast tanks. Only about 1,000 T-34s and 500 kV heavy tanks were available at the outbreak, concentrated in mechanized corps along the western border districts. The first encounters between German panzer divisions and Soviet armored units shocked German commanders. Reports from Army Group Center noted that the new Soviet medium tank, which they identified as the T-34, possessed armor that resisted the standard German 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank gun, known among crews as the door. Even Panzer III tanks equipped with 50mm guns found themselves at a disadvantage, particularly when engaging T-34s frontally. Only the 88mm Flak A 1836 gun, originally designed for anti-aircraft use, could reliably disable the T-34 at range. Nevertheless, the numerical imbalance and poor Soviet command coordination meant that these technological advantages did not prevent early disasters. Soviet mechanized corps, such as the 4th and 8th, attempted large-scale counterattacks in June and July 1941, deploying hundreds of tanks, including T-34s. At the Battle of Brody Dubno between 23 and 30 June, nearly 800 Soviet tanks faced about 600 German panzers. Although T-34s inflicted losses and demonstrated superiority in one-on-one duels, German combined arms tactics, logistical disruption, and air superiority resulted in catastrophic Soviet losses. The Red Army lost over. Survivor accounts highlight both the strengths and weaknesses of the T-34 in this opening phase. German crews described its sloped 45mm armor as resistant to direct fire, while Soviet crews praised its wide tracks, which allowed mobility across muddy terrain where German panzers bogged down. However, mechanical reliability in early models was inconsistent. Gearboxes were prone to breakdown, and shortages of spare parts meant that many tanks had to be abandoned when minor damage occurred. Command and control deficiencies also weakened the T-34's potential. Many early models lacked radios, forcing Soviet crews to rely on signal flags or prearranged maneuvers. German panzer units, by contrast, had widespread radio equipment, enabling coordinated maneuvers and rapid response to Soviet movements. As a result, even technologically inferior Panzer III units often outmaneuvered isolated T-34 platoons. Despite these limitations, the T-34 quickly gained a reputation within the Wehrmacht as a dangerous adversary. Field Marshal von Kleist, commanding Panzergruppe I, later remarked that encountering the T-34 was a deeply unsettling moment for German armored forces, describing it as the best tank in the world at that time. German command quickly requested improvements to their own designs, accelerating the development of the Panzer IV F2 with a long-barreled 75mm gun and the Panther tank, both directly influenced by the T-34. For the Red Army, the opening phase of the war revealed both the promise and the urgent need for expansion of T-34 production. Factories in Kharkov and Stalingrad began shifting into emergency wartime output, while evacuation plans were enacted to move production east of the Ural Mountains, safe from advancing German forces. In 1941 alone, 2,800 T-34s were built, but these numbers struggled to keep pace with heavy losses. By the end of the year, the Red Army had lost nearly 20,000 tanks of all types, yet the T-34 had shown it could withstand German firepower and survive in conditions that crippled other designs. The German advance toward Moscow in the autumn of 1941 provided further opportunities for the T-34 to demonstrate its capabilities. As the Wehrmacht pushed into the Soviet heartland, deteriorating weather transformed roads into impassable mud. German panzer divisions often became immobilized, while T-34s continued to maneuver across marshy ground thanks to their wider track system. In the defense of Moscow, between October and December 1941, Soviet tank brigades armed with T-34s played a critical role in halting and then pushing back German spearheads. During the counteroffensive launched on 5 December, Soviet forces fielded approximately 1,500 tanks, many of them. This early phase of the war established the T-34 not as a perfect weapon, but as a foundation upon which Soviet armored strategy would be rebuilt. It highlighted both the tank's formidable advantages in armor, mobility, and firepower, and the challenges of deploying it effectively within an army that was still recovering from purges, logistical chaos, and rapid territorial losses. From 1941 onward, the T-34 was no longer a secret weapon, but a visible symbol of Soviet resilience, one that German forces acknowledged and Soviet command sought to multiply in overwhelming numbers. As the initial shock of the German invasion subsided, the Soviet High Command recognized that the survival of the Red Army hinged on adapting production and doctrine around the T-34. The early battles of summer 1941 had demonstrated both its technical superiority over most German tanks and the severe shortcomings. What followed in late 1941 and throughout 1942 was a vast mobilization effort aimed at transforming the T-34 from a promising but scarce design into the central weapon of Soviet armored warfare. The first challenge was industrial. The German advance threatened the very factories producing the T-34. Kharkov Locomotive Plant, the birthplace of the design, and the Stalingrad tractor factory were within striking distance of advancing panzer groups by autumn 1941. In response, the Soviet government enacted one of the largest industrial relocations in history. Between July and November 1941, entire assembly lines, machinery, and tens of thousands of workers were dismantled and transported eastward to the Urals, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. The Ural Vagonzavod plant in Nizhny Tagil. Despite initial chaos, by 1942 these plants were producing tanks in quantities that astonished foreign observers. The scale of output reflected the Soviet emphasis on simplification. Early T-34s had been complex machines, with intricate components requiring skilled labor. The wartime redesign in 1942 reduced production time drastically. For example, the casting process for turrets replaced earlier welding methods, and components were standardized across models. The average production time for a single tank dropped from over 8,000 labor hours in 1941 to fewer than 4,000 by late 1942. As a result, 12,500 T-34s were built in 1942 alone, compared to fewer than 3,000 in 1941. On the battlefield, however, this expansion was accompanied by growing pains. German tank development accelerated in direct response to the T-34. The Panzer IV, initially armed with a short-barreled 75mm gun, was upgraded in 1942 with the KWK-40 L-43 long-barreled weapon, capable of penetrating T-34 armor at ranges up to 1,000 meters. Anti-tank weapons also improved. The 50mm PaK-38 became widespread, and the formidable 75mm PaK-40 entered service, threatening Soviet armor at longer distances. The arrival of the Tiger I heavy tank in late 1942, armed with the 88mm KWK-36 gun, represented a new escalation. As a result, the Red Army's strategic deployment of the T-34 evolved. Instead of relying on dispersed mechanized corps, the Soviets reorganized armored forces into independent tank brigades, and later, tank corps. These formations integrated infantry, artillery, and logistical support, making them more resilient in combined arms operations. In January 1942, the 1st Guards Tank Brigade, equipped largely with T-34s, spearheaded the recapture of towns such as Klin and Kalinin. Yet Soviet losses remained high. Throughout 1942, the Red Army lost more than 15,000 tanks, the majority T-34s. At the Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942, Soviet counteroffensives involving several hundred T-34s were encircled and destroyed, with German forces recording the destruction of over 1,000 Soviet tanks during the operation. Mechanical unreliability, limited crew training, and poor coordination often negated the technical advantages of the T-34. Average crew survival rates remained low. Reports indicate that many tanks were lost after only a few days in combat. Nevertheless, the Soviet system's capacity for mass replacement ensured that armored units were never fully depleted. By mid-1942, tank brigades were being replenished in weeks, sometimes deploying with 50 to 100 new T-34s. German reports repeatedly complained that Soviet tank forces seemed inexhaustible, even after heavy engagements. Another critical adaptation concerned the T-34's armament. The original 76.2 mm F-34 gun, adequate in 1941, was increasingly outclassed by the armor of German heavy tanks introduced in 1942. While work on an upgraded model, later the T-34-85, began, the Red Army had to rely on numbers and tactical adaptation to offset German advantages. Tank units employed swarming tactics, concentrating dozens of T-34s against single German strongpoints to overwhelm them by sheer volume of fire and maneuver. The strategic significance of the T-34 during this period cannot be overstated. At a time when the Soviet Union faced crises on every front, by autumn 1942, at the gates of Stalingrad, T-34 units formed the backbone of Soviet tank armies preparing for Operation Uranus, the massive encirclement offensive that would mark a turning point in the war. Thus, the story of the T-34 in 1941-1942 was not one of easy triumph, but of adaptation under extreme pressure. It was a weapon forged not only in factories, but in the crucible of early defeats, transformed by the need to fight an industrial war of attrition. Its value lay not only in individual superiority, but in the capacity of the Soviet state to build, lose, and rebuild it in vast numbers, ensuring that by the end of 1942, the Red Army could still bring armor to the battlefield, in quantities Germany could not hope to match. The summer and autumn of 1942 marked the first period in which the T-34 was deployed. After the failed Soviet spring offensives and the costly defeats around Kharkov, German Army Group South advanced toward the Volga and the Caucasus oil fields, launching Operation Blau in June. The Red Army, still rebuilding after catastrophic losses, relied heavily on tank brigades and corps equipped primarily with T-34s to delay and counter these offensives. The battlefield environment exposed both strengths and weaknesses. On the open steppes of southern Russia, the T-34's wide tracks allowed greater mobility than German panzers, which often became bogged down in dust and mud. Its 76.2 mm F-34 gun was still effective against Panzer III and early model Panzer IV tanks, particularly at short and medium ranges. However, the introduction of the Panzer IV OSF F2 and later G equipped German crews could now engage T-34s at ranges up to 1,000 meters, while Soviet tanks had to close the distance to achieve reliable penetration. This forced Soviet commanders to adopt aggressive tactics, often resulting in heavy losses. One of the largest clashes came during the defensive fighting around Voronezh in July 1942. Soviet tank corps, fielding several hundred T-34s, counterattacked against advancing German formations. The engagements demonstrated the durability of Soviet armor, but also highlighted tactical shortcomings. Many units were committed piecemeal, without sufficient reconnaissance or coordination with artillery. German records indicate that over 300 Soviet tanks were destroyed in a matter of weeks, while German panzer divisions reported around 70-80 tanks irreparably lost. In the urban fighting that began in September 1942, tanks were deployed less in large formations and more as infantry support in street battles. The design proved adaptable. Its relatively compact dimensions allowed it to maneuver through rubble-strewn avenues where heavier tanks like the KV-1 struggled. Soviet reports describe small groups of T-34s providing close fire support, knocking out German strongpoints, and even being camouflaged in ruins for ambushes. German infantry units recorded significant losses to these tactics, as Panzerfausts and other handheld anti-tank weapons had not yet been widely distributed. However, the decisive contribution of the T-34 at Stalingrad came not inside the city, but in the surrounding steppe during Operation Uranus. launched on 19th of November 1942. The Soviet counteroffensive, aimed at encircling the German Sixth Army, relied on massive concentrations of armor. Over 1,000 tanks, the majority T-34s, struck at the weaker Romanian and Italian divisions guarding the German flanks. Against these forces, which possessed few modern anti-tank weapons, the T-34s advanced rapidly, overwhelming resistance. Within a week, the encirclement of Stalingrad was complete, trapping more than 250,000 Axis troops. German records show that anti-tank defenses of their Allied divisions destroyed only a fraction of the attacking armor, while Soviet forces lost several hundred tanks during the offensive, but achieved their strategic aim. The aftermath of Stalingrad demonstrated that the T-34 had become the principal Soviet tool of operational maneuver. It was not invulnerable, losses remained high, but the ability to mass produce and deploy it in concentrations gave the Red Army a decisive advantage. In 1942 alone, approximately 12,500. This disparity grew as the war continued, creating a dynamic where individual German tanks might outperform T-34s in certain duels, but Soviet forces could commit entire corps of armor where Germany could only send a few battalions. Nevertheless, the clash of 1942 also exposed the limits of the T-34-76. Its armor, once nearly impervious to German fire, was now vulnerable at long ranges. Its 76.2 mm gun increasingly struggled against upgraded German tanks and new weapons like the 75 mm PaK-40, which entered widespread service that year. Crew survivability remained poor, with cramped interiors and limited visibility, reducing effectiveness. Soviet commanders and engineers recognized these problems and began planning an upgraded model. In the vast expanses of the Eastern Front, it gave the Soviets mobility and striking power that compensated for earlier disasters. Its role at Stalingrad supporting infantry in brutal urban warfare, then spearheading encirclement operations on the open steppe, highlighted its versatility. The German defeat there signaled that the T-34, mass-produced and adaptable, would continue to shape the direction of the war, forcing the Wehrmacht to escalate its own development and prepare for the armored battles of 1943. The year 1943 marked the point at which the T-34 faced its greatest trial, as the German army sought to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Following the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler authorized Operation Zitadelle, the offensive aimed at eliminating the Soviet salient around Kursk. This plan envisioned the use of Germany's most advanced armored technology, including the newly introduced Panther tank and the Tiger Y heavy tank, both specifically designed with the T-34 in mind. The Red Army, aware of the coming attack through intelligence and reconnaissance, prepared an immense defense in depth, with minefields, anti-tank positions, and reserves of armor that relied primarily on the T-34. By mid-1943, the Soviet Union had produced more than 35,000 T-34s in total since 1940, with 15,700 built in 1942 alone. At the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army deployed around 3,300 T-34s, alongside lighter tanks and self-propelled guns. The German assault force included approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns, of which 146 were Tigers and 200 were Panthers, supported by Ferdinand, Elephant tank destroyers, and standard. In the opening days of July 1943, German armored spearheads pressed into Soviet defenses near Orel in the north and Belgorod in the south. T-34 units, often deployed in ambush positions, engaged the advancing German armor at close range to offset the superior firepower of the long-barreled 75 mm and 88 mm guns mounted on Panthers and Tigers. Casualties were severe. At Prokhorovka on 12th of July, the 5th Guards Tank Army launched a massive counterattack with over 800 T-34s and other vehicles against a Thai SS Panzer Corps, which fielded fewer than 300 tanks, including 15 to 20 Tigers. The Soviet assault suffered heavy losses, approximately 400 tanks disabled in a single day, but the attack blunted the German advance and prevented a breakthrough. German losses, though lighter in absolute numbers, included irreplaceable advanced tanks, while the Soviets quickly replenished their own depleted formations with the T-34-76, still armed with its 76.2mm gun, was no longer sufficient against new German armor. Panthers, with 80mm frontal armor, could withstand frontal hits, while their 75mm KWK-42 guns penetrated T-34 armor at over 1,500 meters. Tigers, with 100mm armor and the 88mm KWK-36 gun, posed an even greater threat. Soviet units compensated through mass tactics, overwhelming German strongpoints with numerical superiority, and close-range attacks where flanking shots could penetrate side armor. Reports indicate that at Prokhorovka, many T-34s closed to ranges under 200 meters before firing, accepting high losses in exchange for disabling heavier enemy tanks. Despite these sacrifices, Kursk was a strategic victory for the Soviet Union. German forces lost approximately 1,600 tanks irreparably, while the Red Army reported over 6,000. By the end of 1943, Soviet factories had produced more than 15,000 additional T-34s, while German production of all tanks that year reached around 6,000. The attritional balance favored the USSR. The lessons of Kursk accelerated the introduction of the upgraded T-34-85. Development had already begun in 1942, but the urgency of facing the Panther and Tiger hastened deployment. The new model featured an 85mm Zeiss S-53 gun, capable of penetrating 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters, and increased frontal armor thickness to 75mm, later up to 90 meters. Its enlarged three-man turret improved crew coordination, correcting one of the persistent weaknesses of the earlier design. For the crews who fought in 1943, the T-34 was both a lifeline and a burden. Survivor accounts describe the difficulty of facing, yet the tank's mechanical reliability, ease of repair, and ability to traverse broken terrain continued to make it the central weapon of Soviet armored warfare. Politically and strategically, Kursk confirmed that the initiative had shifted permanently to the Soviet Union. The T-34, despite its mounting vulnerabilities, was present in every major offensive that followed: Orel, Smolensk, the recapture of Kiev. It had proven itself not invincible but indispensable, the backbone of an industrial war that Germany could not match. The T-34's story in 1943 was one of endurance through crisis, bridging the gap until its successor, the T-34-85, could restore technological parity on the battlefield. Thus, the period of escalation and crisis for the T-34 culminated in the largest tank battle in history. It showed both the obsolescence of the original design against Germany's new weapons and the enduring power of mass production and adaptation. In that balance between loss and replacement, the T-34 remained the weapon that kept the Red Army in the fight and allowed it to move from desperate defense toward decisive offensives. The second half of 1943 and the campaigns of 1944 brought the T-34 into the peak phase of its wartime service, when its mass deployment and the introduction of the upgraded T-34-85 altered the balance of armored warfare in the East. Following the Soviet victory at Kursk, the Red Army transitioned to near-continuous offensives, pressing German forces back across Ukraine, Belarus, and into Poland. In each of these operations, the T-34 was the central tool of Soviet deep battle doctrine, used in massive armored thrusts that exploited breakthroughs and drove into German rear areas. The Battle of the Dnieper, fought from August to December 1943, was the first major campaign in which large numbers of T-34s were used not only for counterattacks but for sustained offensive operations. The Red Army committed more than 2.6 million troops and over 2,400 tanks, the majority T-34s, in an operation stretching nearly 1,400 kilometers along the river. Against them, Army Group South fielded about 1.2 million men and approximately 2,000 tanks and assault guns. Soviet forces lost over 8,000 tanks in the campaign, but replacements arrived continuously from Ural factories. German tank losses were smaller in raw numbers, approximately 2,000, but far harder to replace. By the end of the campaign, Kiev had been liberated, and the Red Army had established multiple bridgeheads across the Dnieper. The arrival of the T-34-85 in early 1944 addressed the vulnerabilities exposed at Kursk. Its 85mm gun allowed the T-34-85's new turret, with 3 crewmen instead of 2, gave commanders the ability to focus on battlefield awareness rather than operating the gun, raising effectiveness in combat. Frontal armor thickness increased to 75 to 90 mm, providing a degree of protection against the long-barreled 75mm gun at longer ranges. This new version began entering the front lines during the spring of 1944. By the summer, thousands had been deployed, supplementing and eventually replacing the older 76mm variant. The impact was immediately visible during Operation Bagration, launched on 22 June 1944, which destroyed Army Group Center in Belarus. The Red Army deployed approximately 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, of which a growing proportion were T-34-85s. German defenders, numbering around 580,000 troops and fewer than 1,000 operational tanks, were overwhelmed. In a 6-week campaign, the Wehrmacht lost nearly 300,000 men killed or captured and hundreds of tanks destroyed, while Soviet losses included over 2,000 tanks. Yet the sheer scale of replacements ensured continued momentum. The peak of the T-34's campaign role was evident in the great offensives of 1944 and early 1945. In the Lvov-Sandomierz operation in July-August 1944, the 1st Ukrainian Front deployed over 800 T-34-85s in a single armored army. These forces smashed through the German 4th Panzer Army, capturing bridgeheads on the Vistula River. German records indicate the loss of more than 200 tanks and assault guns in the operation, compared to Soviet tank losses exceeding 1,200. Again, the numerical exchange favored Germany in individual battles, but Soviet industry had achieved such dominance that each campaign ended with new Soviet bridgeheads. Civilian experiences during this phase reflected the scale of the war as much as the military campaigns. Towns and cities liberated by T-34 spearheads had often been devastated by scorched earth policies or bombardment. In Belarus alone, thousands of villages destroyed earlier in the war were retaken by Soviet armor. For the local population, the appearance of massed T-34s symbolized both destruction and liberation, a weapon that brought both firepower and the possibility of survival after years of occupation. From the German perspective, the peak period of Soviet armored campaigns forced the introduction of ever heavier tanks. The Panther and Tiger II, or Königstiger, were rushed to the front, but their small numbers, fewer than 500 Tiger IIs were ever produced, could not match Soviet mass production. By late 1944, German factories had produced around 3,700 Panthers and 2,300 Tigers of all types, while the USSR had produced more than 40,000 T-34s since 1940, with output continuing at a rate of over 1,200 per month. The Battle of Budapest in late 1944 illustrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the T-34-85. Soviet forces committed more than 1,000 tanks, including large numbers of the new model, in urban fighting that lasted from late December 1944 to February 1945. Losses were severe. Over 700 Soviet tanks were destroyed or disabled in the battle. Yet the city fell, and the Wehrmacht lost approximately 50,000 troops, along with irreplaceable reserves of armor. By the beginning of 1945, the T-34-85 was the most numerous tank on the Eastern Front. German defenders, fielding around 1,000 operational tanks, could not prevent the Soviet advance despite inflicting losses exceeding 1,500 vehicles. Thus, the peak of the campaign phase demonstrated the T-34 not simply as a tank superior or inferior to its opponents, but as the material embodiment of Soviet industrial strength and operational doctrine. Its role was not to achieve tactical dominance in individual duels, but to deliver massed armored thrusts that Germany could not counter over the long term. In 1944, the T-34 reached its fullest expression as the decisive instrument of Soviet offensives, carrying the Red Army across Eastern Europe and positioning it for for the final battles of the war in Germany itself. As the Red Army pushed deeper into Central and Eastern Europe during late 1944 and early 1945, the T-34 continued to evolve in its battlefield role. What had begun as a machine designed for maneuver warfare on the open steppe was now tested in dense forests, fortified cities, and river crossings across Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. These changing conditions forced both technical and tactical adaptations, shaping how Soviet crews used the T-34 in the final year of the war. German forces had by this point committed their remaining reserves of advanced armor. The Panther, with its long-barreled 75mm KWK-42 gun and 80mm of sloped frontal armor, was produced in greater numbers than the Tiger, but never exceeded 6,000 units total. The Tiger II, with up to 150 of frontal armor, and the powerful 80mm KWK-43 gun, appeared in small numbers from mid-1944. Against these machines, the standard T-34-76 was obsolete, but the T-34-85 provided a fighting chance. Soviet records indicate that in direct encounters, a T-34-85 needed to close to within 800 to 1,000 meters to reliably penetrate a Panther, while the Panther could destroy a T-34-85 at ranges beyond 1,500 meters. This imbalance reinforced Soviet reliance on mass employment, coordinated artillery preparation, and maneuver rather than isolated tank duels. One notable campaign illustrating this adaptation was the Sandomier's bridgehead battles in August 1944. Soviet forces, attempting to hold their positions on the west bank of the Vistula River, faced counterattacks by the German 4th Panzer Army, which deployed nearly 200 Panthers and Tigers. The defending Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army fielded around 500 tanks, primarily T-34-85s. Losses were heavy: over 250 Soviet tanks knocked out in weeks of fighting. The ability to absorb such losses and maintain momentum reflected both the numerical availability of T-34s and the industrial system behind them. Urban combat provided further challenges. In Budapest during late 1944 and early 1945, T-34-85s fought street by street, often advancing under heavy artillery and infantry cover. The city's defenders included Waffen-SS units with Panthers and assault guns, supported by heavily fortified positions. Soviet forces committed more than 1,000 tanks, but in the course of the siege lost over 700, many destroyed by close-range Panzerfausts. German records indicate that their armored formations lost around 250 tanks and assault guns in the battle, along with nearly all of their manpower. Despite the high cost, the fall of Budapest deprived Germany of its last significant ally in the East and marked another step toward total collapse. Adaptations were not limited to combat tactics. Soviet engineers improved field repair and recovery systems, recognizing the necessity of keeping damaged T-34s in circulation. Reports show that up to 40% of tanks disabled in combat could be recovered, repaired, and returned to service, often within days. Mobile repair workshops followed armored armies, and the tank's relatively simple construction allowed for quicker restoration compared to the mechanically complex Panthers and Tigers. German records frequently noted that their own vehicles, once immobilized, were difficult to recover due to weight and mechanical fragility. Psychological factors also became more pronounced. For Soviet troops, the presence of large numbers of T-34s symbolized both protection and offensive power. For German soldiers, the appearance of waves of T-34, even when German gunners knocked out dozens, the sense that replacements were already on the way undermined morale. By early 1945, the Red Army prepared for its final push toward Berlin. The Vistula-Oder offensive in January was a demonstration of the maturity of Soviet armored doctrine. More than 7,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, including thousands of T-34-85s, advanced 500 kilometers in just 3 weeks, overwhelming around 1,000 German armored vehicles and encircling multiple divisions. Losses on both sides were significant, with Soviet records showing over 1,500 tanks lost, but the operational results were decisive. The Red Army stood on the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. The campaigns of late 1944 and early 1945 underscored the T-34's capacity for adaptation. It was no longer the dominant tank in terms of individual performance, yet the T-34's combination of adequate firepower, mobility, and sheer numbers gave the Red Army a weapon system that could absorb losses and continue advancing. The psychological and strategic effects of this endurance were as important as technical specifications. By continuously improving tactics, introducing the 85mm variant, and streamlining recovery and repair, the Soviets ensured that the T-34 remained the decisive instrument of their armored forces in the final stages of the war. Thus, the period of resistance and adaptation saw the T-34 evolve once again, not by making it invulnerable, but by embedding it into a system that compensated for its weaknesses. As the Red Army prepared for its final campaigns on German soil, the T-34 had proven its resilience, ensuring it would remain central to Soviet operations until the very last days of the war in Europe. By the spring of 1945, the T-34 was positioned to play its most decisive role in the climactic battles that determined the fate of the war in Europe. The Soviet High Command had concentrated enormous forces along the Oder and Neisse rivers, preparing for the final assault on Berlin. At this point, the Red Army had assembled more than 6.7 million troops, 41,600 artillery pieces, and nearly 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns in the 1st Belarusian, 1st Ukrainian, and 2nd Belarusian fronts. The backbone of these armored forces remained the T-34-85, supported by heavy IS-2 tanks and a variety of self-propelled guns. Against them, the remnants of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS fielded approximately 1 million men, 10,400 artillery pieces, and 1,502,000 operational tanks, including Panthers, Tiger Is, Tiger IIs, and a scattering of assault guns. The opening of the Berlin offensive on 16th of April 1945 at the Battle of the Seelow Heights demonstrated both the strengths and the limitations of the T-34-85. Soviet forces launched massive frontal assaults, supported by 20,000 artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket barrages, but the Germans had prepared multiple defensive belts, fortified with bunkers, minefields, and anti-tank guns. T-34 units advancing across waterlogged ground and narrow causeways encountered devastating fire from 88mm and 75mm weapons. Soviet tank brigades lost hundreds of vehicles in the first days, with estimates suggesting that some formations lost up to 60% of their strength. Nevertheless, Soviet commanders committed reserves, maintaining pressure until German defenses were exhausted. By 19th of April, the Seelow Heights had fallen, and Soviet tank armies poured westward toward Berlin. Once inside the city, the T-34's role shifted dramatically. Urban combat required tanks to operate in close coordination with infantry, engineers, and artillery. German defenders, many armed with Panzerfausts, turned Berlin into a labyrinth of ambushes. A single well-placed shot could destroy a T-34-85 in the narrow streets. Soviet tactics, adapted by advancing tanks in groups of 2 or 3, supported by storm groups of infantry who cleared buildings and rooftops. Although losses remained high, several hundred T-34s were destroyed in the battle for Berlin alone. The sheer weight of Soviet numbers overwhelmed the defenders. German armored formations committed to the city, including fewer than 80 operational Panthers and Tiger IIs, were systematically destroyed. By the time the Reichstag was stormed on 30th of April, Soviet records indicate that the 1st Belarusian Front alone had lost more than 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns. Parallel operations further underscored the T-34's importance. In Hungary during the battles of early 1945, including Operation Conrad and the Siege of Budapest, German counterattacks with Panther and Tiger units inflicted severe losses on Soviet tank armies. Yet every German success was temporary. Soviet forces could commit fresh T-34 brigades within days, while German armored reserves were irreplaceable. By March 1945, the defeat of German forces in Hungary secured the Soviet southern flank, allowing additional T-34 equipped formations to join the drive into Austria and Czechoslovakia. The turning point in the final months was not a single battle, but the cumulative collapse of German armored strength. Even when T-34-85s faced technical inferiority against heavy German tanks, their strategic effect came from numbers, operational tempo. German units such as the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, equipped with Tiger IIs, could destroy dozens of T-34s in isolated encounters, but the Soviet response was simply to outmaneuver and overwhelm them with concentrated firepower. By late April, even elite German armored battalions were reduced to fewer than a dozen operational vehicles, while Soviet tank armies continued to field hundreds. Civilian populations in Eastern and Central Europe experienced the T-34 as the visible instrument of Soviet power. From Warsaw to Vienna, its arrival signaled both the collapse of German control and the imposition of new authority. For many, the sight of long columns of T-34s rolling through city streets was synonymous with the end of occupation. Yet the destruction they left behind, ruined infrastructure, burned villages, and shattered urban centers. From a purely military perspective, the final campaigns confirmed the Soviet method of armored warfare: depth, relentless pressure, and mass deployment. In the Vistula-Oder offensive alone, launched in January 1945, Soviet tank armies advanced up to 500 kilometers in less than 3 weeks, destroying or capturing more than 35 German divisions. By May, the Red Army had deployed more than 12,000 tanks across the Central European theater, with the majority still T-34 variants. The German Army, by contrast, could muster fewer than 2,500 armored vehicles of all types across the same front. By the time Germany surrendered on 8 May 1945, the T-34 had proven itself not as an invincible weapon, but as the most strategically significant tank of the war. It was present in every decisive Soviet offensive of 1944-1945, from Belarus to Berlin. It enabled breakthroughs at Silo. Its losses were immense, but its replacements were endless. The turning point that began with Kursk reached its culmination in the ruins of the German capital, where the T-34 stood as both the symbol and the instrument of Soviet victory. Thus, in the final stages of the war, the T-34's story became inseparable from the collapse of the Third Reich. It had carried the Red Army from the brink of destruction in 1941 to triumph in 1945. Its design adapted and refined, its numbers multiplied beyond any rival. For crews, it remained a demanding and dangerous machine. For commanders, it was the essential tool of strategy. For civilians, it was both liberator and destroyer. Its role in these final battles cemented its place not just as a weapon of war, but as the decisive armored force of the European theater. With the capitulation of Germany in May 1945, the Red Army's tank units did not simply disband and fade into history. Instead, the T-34 entered a new stage of service in the immediate aftermath of the war, when Europe lay in ruins and questions of political control, security, and military reorganization dominated. The Soviet Union had mobilized an unprecedented armored force to reach Berlin, and at the center of this force stood tens of thousands of T-34s. In 1945 alone, Soviet factories had produced nearly 12,000 of them, and total wartime output exceeded 57,000. Their presence defined both the battlefield and the post-war order. The immediate aftermath of combat was marked by enormous losses. Archival data show that between 1941 and 1945, the Red Army lost around 44,900 T-34s in combat, including both the 76mm and 85mm variants. This figure reflects both the ferocity of the Eastern Front and the Soviet approach to mass employment. Yet despite these staggering losses, the Soviets never ran short of tanks. In the final campaigns of 1945, Soviet tank armies entered Berlin and Vienna with more than 10,000 operational vehicles, most of them T-34-85s. In the weeks after victory, many of these tanks remained stationed across Eastern Europe as part of the Soviet occupation forces. Large contingents of T-34s were deployed in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. Their role shifted from frontline combat to policing and deterrence. German civilians saw them in city squares and at crossroads, reminders of the Soviet Union's military presence. For the Soviet leadership, the T-34 became an instrument not only of war, but of post-war influence, underpinning the establishment of socialist regimes across Eastern Europe. At the same time, the Red Army evaluated lessons learned. Reports emphasized the decisive importance of mass production, simplicity, and adaptability. The T-34's balance of mobility, protection, and firepower had proven sufficient to carry Soviet forces through to victory, even against technologically superior German tanks. Yet weaknesses were also acknowledged. The high casualty rates among crews, the vulnerability to German heavy guns, and the limited ergonomic design. These findings influenced the development of post-war tanks, including the T-44, T-54, and eventually the T-55, which borrowed heavily from T-34 design principles but incorporated thicker armor, more powerful guns, and improved crew conditions. The T-34's post-war service was not confined to Europe. With Japan still at war until August 1945, Soviet tank armies equipped with T-34s redeployed eastward to take part in Operation August Storm. During this offensive against the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria, Soviet forces committed over 5,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, of which a significant proportion were T-34s. The campaign, launched on 9th of August 1945, saw Soviet armored spearheads advance up to 800 kilometers in just 11 days, overwhelming Japanese defenses. Japanese anti-tank weaponry, largely based on outdated 37mm and 47mm guns, proved ineffective against the T-34's armor. Soviet records report the loss of fewer than 200 tanks in the entire campaign, a striking contrast to the high losses endured in Europe. The transition from combat to occupation duties also revealed logistical strains. Soviet tank brigades that had fought in Central Europe required extensive refurbishment. Many T-34s were worn from years of continuous campaigning. Engines were exhausted, armor patched from field repairs, and weapons barrels near the end of their service life. Recovery and overhaul facilities worked at full capacity, often rebuilding tanks with parts from destroyed vehicles. Despite these conditions, the Soviet Union retained one of the largest armored forces in the world, with more than 40,000 operational T-34s at the end of 1945. For civilians in liberated or occupied territories, the presence of the T-34 carried complex meanings. In Warsaw, Budapest, and Prague, its silhouette was etched into memory as the machine that rolled through city streets in the final days of the war. For some, it symbolized liberation from Nazi rule. For others, it represented the arrival of a new form of foreign domination. The same tank that had battered through German defenses now stood as the physical emblem of Soviet authority in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies studied the T-34 closely. Captured examples examined after the Western tank designers acknowledged its influence, with the American M26 Pershing and the British Centurion incorporating lessons that paralleled Soviet design philosophy. The early stages of the Cold War would, in many ways, continue the technological dialogue first begun between the T-34 and its German adversaries. Thus, in the aftermath of the war, the T-34 bridged the transition from total conflict to uneasy peace. It remained the backbone of Soviet armored forces, a symbol of victory, and a practical tool for projecting influence across Eurasia. Its battlefield role diminished, but its political and strategic role expanded. By late 1945, the tank that had first appeared in small numbers during the crisis of 1941 stood as the most widely produced and widely deployed armored vehicle in the world, a machine whose story had moved beyond individual battles to shape the geopolitical order of the post-war era. The legacy of the T-34 after 1945 extended far beyond the battlefields of the Second World War. It was not only the tank that had carried the Red Army from the brink of destruction to the streets of Berlin, it became a global symbol of Soviet military power and a weapon that influenced armored doctrine for decades. In terms of sheer production, the T-34 was unmatched. More than 57,000 units of the 76mm version and around 2,500 of the 85mm variant were built during the war and in the immediate post-war years. This enormous number ensured that the T-34 would remain in frontline service long after newer designs entered production. Politically, the T-34 was central to the image of Soviet victory. It was paraded in Red Square in June 1945 and in the years that followed, because at the same time, its presence in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia reminded populations of the enduring Soviet military presence and influence. The tank was both commemorated as a liberator and regarded as a reminder of occupation, reflecting the dual nature of its legacy. Militarily, the T-34 remained active in Soviet service well into the 1950s. Though gradually replaced by the T-54-55 series, the sheer availability of T-34s meant that thousands were refurbished, upgraded, and exported. By 1955, more than 40 countries had received T-34s, including states in Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. North Korea deployed hundreds in the Korean War of 1950-1953, where they faced American M24 Chafees, M26 Pershings, and eventually M46 Pattons. While the T-34s initially outmatched light American tanks, they suffered heavy losses once heavier U.S. armor and superior air power. Nonetheless, their role in the early stages of the war demonstrated the continuing relevance of the design 5 years after World War II ended. Elsewhere, T-34s served in conflicts as diverse as the Arab-Israeli Wars, the Indo-Pakistani conflicts, and wars of decolonization in Africa. In many of these theaters, the tank's simplicity, ruggedness, and ease of repair made it effective despite its age. In 1967 and 1973, for example, Arab armies fielded T-34s alongside more modern Soviet tanks. Although outclassed by Israeli Centurions and Pattons, T-34s were still used for infantry support and secondary roles. In Vietnam, both the North Vietnamese Army and Allied states operated T-34s, continuing the design's global reach into the 1970s. From a technological perspective, the T-34 influenced nearly every subsequent generation. Its emphasis on the balance between firepower, protection, and mobility, rather than extreme specialization, remained the guiding principle of modern tank development. Even NATO strategists in the 1950s acknowledged that Soviet tank doctrine, built on the T-34, posed the most serious conventional threat to Western Europe. The T-34 also carried cultural weight. In the Soviet Union, war memoirs, films, and textbooks elevated it as the weapon of victory. While this narrative simplified the complexity of the Eastern Front and overlooked the high casualties suffered by its crews, it reinforced the tank's symbolic role in Soviet identity. In the West, military historians analyzed it as the definitive example of how industrial capacity, standardization, and operational doctrine could outweigh purely technical superiority. The Wehrmacht's Tiger and Panther tanks are remembered as formidable machines, but they were produced in thousands. The T-34 was produced in tens of thousands, and that difference shaped the outcome of the war. Debates continue among historians over the degree to which the T-34 was revolutionary versus evolutionary. Some argue that it synthesized existing ideas: Christie suspension, sloped armor, medium-caliber gun, rather than creating something entirely new. Others emphasize that its timing, appearing in 1940 when no other army possessed a medium tank of similar balance, made it truly transformative. Either way, the T-34's impact was undeniable. It forced Germany to accelerate development of the Panther, altered Allied assessments of armored warfare, and provided the Soviet Union with the industrial and military foundation to fight a war of attrition it could win. By the late 20th century, most T-34s had been retired from frontline service, but thousands remained in reserve or ceremonial use. As late as the 1990s, reports indicated T-34s still in use in parts of Africa and Asia. Museums and memorials worldwide preserve them, not only as military artifacts but as symbols of the immense human and material cost of the Second World War. The T-34's legacy is thus multi-layered. It was a battlefield instrument of Soviet victory, a post-war export that armed dozens of nations, a technological influence that shaped armored warfare, and a cultural symbol remembered in both pride and fear. Its story reflects the broader story of the Eastern Front itself, massive in scale, brutal in its losses, decisive in its outcomes, and transformative in world history. More than any other tank, the T-34 embodied the intersection of industry, strategy, and resilience. It remains one of the most studied and recognized armored vehicles in history, its presence still felt in debates about how machines and men together shape the outcome of war.